Hello everyone, today we talk briefly about the difference between banal and territorial lordship. I already made a video on banal lordship and generally speaking the seigneurial system, and so the various, as we'll see now, superimpositions of factual and formal, let's say, power in the dramatic political and social fragmentation of post-Carolingian Europe. That is, however, one of the most say founding moments, especially of the old regime and of the same Vassalatic-Beneficiary system and feudalism, for how and this blend between what were essentially the public, what was the public law of Romano-Germanic origin was came to, let's say, almost overlap by a certain degree, because again everything went dramatically privatized with the feudal one that, at least at a formal level, was law itself was very intertwined, and sometimes, especially at this point, say we're not necessarily talking about the post-Carolingian era, but also later times, where it was being gradually codified. In some areas, was just like more like a custom, right? And we are in any case talking about real power ratios, right? So that even the public authority that remained, in theory, as we have seen, very often was remaining in theory, because in practice also the public authorities were still there, right? So somewhere their existence still made the various private powers, reflecting also on the affinity that existed between the two kinds of power, and how in fact the same banal lords could actually own in practice some public offices and so on. Again, very complex, and that's why I'm making lots of videos about this stuff, because I know that you don't like these topics. You want me to talk about the Slavs fundamentally, but I see it from the views. But these things are basically the only possible way to understand fundamentally most of medieval history, right? It may seem, especially in this fragmented way, so many videos. I made a playlist now, seigneurial system, especially if you want to navigate yourself in this, say, in this perilous sea. It's actually, it does make sense. Historiography, when you get to understand it, it's much simpler than it seems. Historiography, after all, has made a great effort, especially continental Europe, that was very careful about this dynamics, especially in France and Italy, and for obvious reasons, because those were the areas where these relations developed the most. To abstract a little, for the sake of teaching, same mechanism to properly enucleate from a theoretical point of view how the thing was, independently eventually from the single cases that are always the ones that we cannot, however, abstract from. So hopefully at some point we will also look at those more in detail, because otherwise you say, but what are we talking about? One aspect that is connected to today's topic is, for example, how, I don't know, a family of peasants could have in management a mansus, so this standard land plot unit that became universal, especially in Carolingian Europe, but it already existed before as standard in other countries previously to that, of a seigneurial court, right? So a mansus that belonged fundamentally to a lord, and that these peasants worked on, could depend, besides that, obviously, from powers of official public tradition, right? So this land could have been initially, part of a domain, right? And the lord just administered it in ever more private fashion. That also pre-existed, so public powers that persisted or developed in further in very vast regional scale, right? Not the say, not even after the main partitions of the various Carolingian kingdoms, you actually have an end of the border modifications, right? We have seen it in a video some month ago, right? How some, and also in the historical regions of Europe series, because especially, I don't know, the Duchy of Burgundy, these areas that in part were created out of scratch as political entities, because they emanated literally from real power ratios that had a few to do with the pre-existing districts that still the king, however, had the faculty of modifying publicly, officially. Well, this generic peasant family could depend for the superimposition of power, not just, in fact, on this private local power, but and the and a public one, but even on more private powers of two lords immediately and differently. That is to say, literally without any attrition, maybe without the two lords at the same time. For example, one lord of these two could be the owner of the land that the peasant family worked on. The other be the lord of the fortress within which the peculiar area of protection of the same land came to be. And this military aspect also is, in fact, importantly connected to the Banal character. Why? Because here, first of all, when you talk about lords, we could be talking even about, I don't know, rich merchants, right? The idea of lords just as necessarily the ultra militaristic power, etc. In fact, is shaded. They could have people who owned land just on their own, and they had people working on that. But this land could fall under the control of a truly military power, something specifically, in fact, secular in its military nature. We were talking recently about, in fact, how the great ecclesiastical land estates were very often properly also prey, in fact, of the secular military class. That, of course, coexisted also with the ecclesiastical powers that were, in fact, forces to be reckoned on their own, but that were in theory more like, civil, more peaceful in theory. And so this set of dependency was to be found in the same communities that inhabited the land. I mean, the same peasant literally had to respond in different measure to the guy he owned the land he was working on, towards whom, for example, had a land exploitation contract of some sort, dependency in that regard, that encompassed all a series of things. I mean, maybe the degree of military protection was also shared by the two lords, as we'll see now. Well, the other one, let's say the more powerful one from a military point of view, also connected upon this peasant in a kind of equally military function. Like the local villagers had to take up arms to support the lord's retinue in case of, for the same sake of defense. This already shows you also how this power was shared with the same communities that lived on the land. Because again, these were not times where peasants were devoid of any freedom, right? And on the contrary, they had still a large and important one at this point, that they could negotiate with these lords. And naturally, the two lords were in some form of relation with one another, because they shared this space, the communities that inhabited them, properly the functions, right? We should also actually eliminate the idea of space per se, right? Space was not a big deal in of itself. There were seigneuries that were scattered, disarticulated territorially, but I don't know. You could own a seigneury somewhere for using, for the rights of using a mill. Then maybe the land was not even yours, it was somebody else's, but maybe you had contracted that at some point. Maybe it was 50 kilometers away from the area which instead you exercised more direct power on the local communities. And you could sell those things, you could monetize them. That is to say, maybe the guy in fact that had the land around the mill factually owned the mill, but he was asked by a contract that you should have honored, but at some point it may have also properly been lost. Parties were customs what had not been written down, but sometimes what the ownership of that mill meant is that was some part of the revenue of the local lord will arrive to you. So it is that complicated. But in general, and so again, the two lords could have had attritions, conflict, etc. And so this invested the same peasants in the same way, because whose allegiance do you have to honor in a way? That's why he still maintained a degree of militarization, because he immediately himself, I'm talking about the peasant communities, because in themselves they could come to decide to take one side or another, that maybe invariably entailed to fight at some point. So these scholars thus distinguish the so-called, in fact, landed seigneury from the local territorial seigneury, that in this sense is denominated in harmony with an expression especially frequent in the Italian sources of the 12th century, that is very clear, that is the Dominatus Loci, right? So the idea of a rule, a local rule, a ruler of the place, of the land, but also indicated in a more Germanic sense, which means basically the same thing now, as we will see, as banal seigneury. Again, I made a video about banal seigneury, explaining what it is, from the old Germanic term ban, in fact, that corresponded to the Latin one of districtio, or districtum, which we mostly think like in more a civil, neutral sense of the district, of the administrative repartition, but it was something else, because that repartition was denominated as banal already in Carolingian times to signify the right and also the same power of command, and to coerce for a finality of public order. That is to say, I am in charge here, and I have a power that allows me literally to exercise some rights, including the one, for example, of mobilizing the local militia, or literally a military one in practice. So it's the real actual power, the one that you can properly sense, touch, measure, in the form of who's in charge, who commands, who has the power, who's the ruler here. So in the Carolingian era, such ban was owed logically, but not practically, only to the king and to his representatives in the provinces. Hence also the overlapping in a way with the district as an idea, because district literally means to hold together, right, to maintain that control. While in post-Carolingian times, forming itself, sometimes even by royal will or by more often a spontaneous process, autonomous military areas, and sometimes also very, in fact, local ones, very narrow in a sense. Also within the district, the term was, but also beyond, by the way, but not necessarily overlapping with it too, because it could straddle across multiple pre-existing districts that were the comital diocesan ones historically by Romano-Germanic tradition. The term was used to define it properly at the time. The one of, say, every lord that exercised on his or other lord's peasants, and even more in general on the residents of a determinate territory of local or regional width, a coercive protection. So literally, here we are measuring who was commanding, in a way, who was owning the imperium. That was the prerogative for which initially whoever the Romans, the Germans, had claimed as legitimate rule, legitimate power. When we speak of public power, that's factually it. It's the emperor's one, or the king's one, because that's the guy who has the capacity to command, to control, because he detains the imperium. So don't let yourself be fooled by this idea of public in the sense that we intend today, which is a purely emptied, laïcistic, and secularistic fashion, because we understand the advantages of an important power, but we kind of strive to understand the meaning of power, why there are countries that are powerful, there are forces that are powerful, and politically we're so disoriented that becomes just this abstract defense of freedom. When you don't understand if there is a power out here, it's because that power has been earned. It doesn't stand on somebody else's feet, right? And so today's times, especially, this enormous confusion about understanding the most elementary sides, and just hysterically shouting out, those guys are too powerful. And do you have an idea why they're so powerful? Because maybe the people are from their side, and because it's functional, and it does make sense, and it's how every power has always functioned in the world. No, but these ones are bad because you're paranoid. You want to destroy the world into something smaller and smaller, that is something weaker and weaker and ever less disorderly. So essentially the complete direct direction which civilization has gone historically, and for which these people in fact were kind of striving to put together such power in a time which power wasn't there, right? So this is, again, in fact, very, as I often say, the Middle Ages help dramatically to understand today's times. And people reason in terms of pre-Westphalian, post-Westphalian. Actually, the nature of power has always been the same, right? You can have more or less direct references, institutionally, etc. But in practice, power is always exercised in a way or another that escapes formality, or just has its own ways, that is able to catalyze very often the power of other institutions. And that's, again, a positive thing, because it means there is a sustaining force that makes it work, and not conspiracy theory like these have been corrupted, have been bought, that there is all a problem behind that there is a single thought that is being posed. Oh my God, where, if you believe that, you probably seriously have psychological problems, but real ones, because again, especially from a channel that told Clausewitzian theory, not understanding the ABC of politics to that point is like, restart from scratch, because it's maybe better. In any case, this, when you study this high medieval powers, you realize ever more realistically how how in fact solid and logical certain dominations fundamentally were. Because if you understand properly the mechanism through which they had formed, even in the absence of, in fact, a sometimes properly progressed public pattern, this is typical of this age, and it's typical of feudalism in general, right? Naturally, different areas of Europe behave differently, but it's exactly from the more complex ones, that are the more developed ones, that you see the greatest engineering, right? What is of these powers? Because it's paradoxical, but feudalism in itself had a gluing force that other realities that maybe had, namely a kind of more evident public order, just even by custom, not necessarily even by a statal standard, they couldn't afford, right? And so from feudal Europe, and generally speaking, this fragmentation apparently of power, that, we talk about feudal Europe, but we understand feudal in a kind of post-Carolingian sense, where you could find here many other actors that are not feudal, they're just everybody. But let's say the private element that keeps them together by a certain degree is still the one that, again, that private form still responds to a real need, to a real power, to a real necessity, mechanism, and or dynamic that had brought it to rule. Now, yeah, I think this is it. We will keep talking in any case about such things. For today, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.